Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to episode 282 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technological firm that helps clients manage risk across 4 key areas. Those areas include sales and sales channels, including distributors, resellers, and partners, suppliers, customers, and human capital, consisting of employees and contractors. You can find out more information on the Red Flag Group at www.redflaggroup.com. Today I have part 2 of my SCCE 2016 Compliance and Ethics Institute podcast. I have with me Mike Volkov from the Volkov Law Group, Matt Kelly from Radical Compliance, and Jonathan Armstrong from Coterie Compliance in London. We tackle several topics today, including the parallel tracks of training that are available now. We ask the question, should compliance be involved in CEO compensation, and add a discussion on clawbacks. I provide some highlights of the SCCE Award dinner and the SCCE Compliance and Ethics Award winners. We discuss the differences in FCPA corridor conferences and the SCCE conference. We take a look at whether academia will supply the next generation of compliance professionals. I asked the question, are companies making the same mistakes over and over and over again in compliance, or are we seeing some new and different types of frauds? We take a look at the board of directors' role in compliance. Jonathan Armstrong gives us some thoughts on the perception, or change of perception in the serious fraud office in the United Kingdom. And we end with a short discussion on human trafficking and open borders. The episode comes in at about 45 minutes. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance.
You know, and that raises a really good question, because one of the areas of feedback that I've gotten from people this year is the difference of what you're talking about. There are people who are here for basics.
Right.
But there are people who are really looking, there are people who are sort of beyond that and want to go to the next level. And so I had people asking, I got some sort of feedback on that this was a little elementary. I really want some help in this area, which is, data analytics and third parties or something like that. And I wonder about how, and as compliance matures, what's going to happen here? Are we always going to have an elementary level, and then are we going to break into and then have a parallel course for sort of more experienced people? But I see sort of a growing need in both areas, to tell you the truth. And I don't know what...
I agree with you.
Let me pitch that one to Matt, because you've run conferences, so you've bumped up against this for several years. Where do you think we might be headed?
That is a good question that when I was at Compliance Week and we ran that conference for years there, I think that there is a need for thought leadership, and not just, how often can we talk about building a strong ethical culture, which we certainly could, but more, how do regulations and corporate governance work? Like, that's the sort of, I would guess, cutting edge thought leadership that's out there, especially because, frankly, regulators change over time, and there's new presidents, new Congresses, they come up with new laws that pose new challenges. There's that. There is still, I wouldn't even call it basics so much as I would call it the mechanics of putting compliance into operations. One thing that I have been doing these days since I started my own firm is I go and I talk with a lot of the software vendors who cater more to internal audit and internal control audiences. And they're aware that compliance is out there and it's important. But when you go to those software firms, people like Workiva, people like ACL, they go to their user conferences. They're every bit as big as this one. And that's just for one company. And then there are multiple companies who do this. And we're talking about thousands of people.
But what's the level at those conferences? Do you still have people sort of just getting into the field? And then you also have your sort of people who want to go to the next level?
It is, I don't want to say getting into the field so much as they are following a natural arc of a career. For internal audit and internal control, it's a little bit more well understood. There are certainly a lot more junior auditors or data analysts there.
SOX managers, all that.
Yes, and some of them are just learning how to actually use the product. But, they are very much immersed in the mechanics of how would we actually measure out and collect all the information about those other senior people at the thought leadership conferences coming up with the big ideas of how to do all this.
Mm-hmm.
You're still going to have to data analyze it or datafy it. I don't want to claim credit for that word.
But one of the drawbacks, I mean, in the advanced discussion group, there were more than 50 people who probably wanted to come to a lot of those things, and so there's clearly a demand for it. So
Right.
how do we get more of those? And I'll tell you, Jay, I thought the format was great. It was my first time doing it, and I thought it was great because people started to talk to each other, and saying, this is what we do, and that was fantastic. And I would, have people raise their hands. What would you do? And then that sparked the discussion. And I think we need more of that at this conference. And I just like the format.
The interesting thing in Jay's session, and one of the others with Richard Beestrong I went to, but yours particularly, Jay, it seemed that I think almost everybody in the room contributed. And I know that's in part because you encouraged them to, and you picked people who hadn't said things. But I struggle to think of anyone in the room who didn't have something to share. And I agree. I mean, I think that probably the two most valuable sessions I went to maybe were the advanced discussion groups. Yeah. And there is some source there that needs bottling.
So let me change the focus and really start off at least with Matt and you, Jonathan. Roy Snell posed a question to me about executive compensation. Should compliance be involved in that decision, as in CEO compensation? Mm-hmm. Matt has written about executive compensation, and we're picking on you because you're our only Brit. Yeah. And we know Theresa May has raised this as an issue. So my answer was I didn't think compliance should be involved in base salary, but perhaps have visibility into any bonuses or incentive compensation. What are your thoughts after writing about it for several weeks?
That it is a good idea that some sort of conscience of the company should give the board's compensation committee a kick in the rear end to think a bit more about executive compensation risks. I don't necessarily know the compliance officer is the right person to do that, because when you look at Mylan Labs, which on my blog, I pick on Mylan as a very good example of their executive compensation drove them to take these tremendous reputation risks, but they didn't do anything illegal and they didn't do anything against compliance rules. They reported all the proper disclosures that there would have been nothing for the compliance officer to do there, because that pay package was like, yeah, that's according to all the SEC rules, which is a big part of what a compliance officer has to worry about. There's still disclosure and technical regulatory filings. But there was an enormous, I guess, moral imperative here that totally blew up in Mylan's face. So I do wonder who could do that. Not necessarily a compensation consultant who's in the paid employ of the comp committee. I don't know who it would be, but it would be a brave compliance officer who would be able to kind of tell the corporate compliance, the compensation committee, it's not necessarily doing its job as smart as it could.
I think that's the key, isn't it, really? Who does set it? I mean, I think from the Theresa May point of view, I think where she's coming from is we've almost had retrofitting the withdrawal of compensation from banks, for example. When banks have gone into state ownership, we've tried to claw back some of the bonuses they've paid. I think there's quite an interesting case in Scotland in the last few weeks. And basically, you might have seen it, the Braid case, which is a failure to prevent bribery. So the first case is company fails to prevent bribery. There's gifts, there's holidays, etc. going on. Company pays a fine of, I think, 2.2 million sterling. Then the second case that we just had in the last few weeks is by, so one of the shareholders seemingly knew about the bribery scheme, thought it was bonus payments and incentives, and apparently turned a blind eye. The other shareholders say he, at the very least, ought to have made more inquiries, he ought to have drilled down more. And they were successful in a civil action of getting the value of his shares written down for his culpability. So his shareholding goes from ballpark 20 million sterling to 2, I think. So more or less, the payment and some comes out of his share value. And that seems to me to be quite interesting. Now, how you assess diminution in value of the stock for culpability. I think that's exactly the same reasons as you said. Who can do that? Can the non-execs do it?
No.
Well, are they skilled to do it? Can you get some sort of external auditor? I'm not sure that that's the case. Obviously, in Braid, it's sort of left down to the judge. That's not ideal, but off the top of my head, that seems to be about the best solution. But I think all of that sort of thing is interesting. I think there's an appetite to tie compensation, and almost instead of it being a retrospective, we will reduce compensation after the event if things have gone badly. Logically, it should be more proactive. If you get good,
Yes.
then you will get more money, rather than if you get bad, we'll try and claw the money back somehow. But how you do that, I agree with you.
I will say an excellent idea that somebody else had mentioned in that same session with you and Roy Snell was somebody said that somehow get ethics and compliance more involved in the nominating and governance committee that would ultimately take the lead on picking a CEO and on board directors.
Right.
And if you find good ethical people that way, I think more of these problems would be diminished. Like, I will pick on Wells Fargo and whether we are going to claw back CEO compensation there, and will that happen or not. If you had picked the right sort of ethical leader CEO, even if this problem happened, he probably would have had enough horse sense to do the politically diplomatic thing and volunteer to give up his pay without a clawback, which would have solved a lot of Wells Fargo's PR problems, at least. But it seems like that idea is just alien to the executives at the bank right now. So,
Well, let me just throw into the mix I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the case, but within the past week, there was a SOX 404 clawback case around restatements, where a company had to make a restatement. SOX 404 provides for executive clawback from the CFO and the CEO who had certified the original financial statements. And the court held that it wasn't a requirement that the CEO or CFO's actions, their mistakes may have led to the restatement or the faulty accounting. It was simply the fact they certified. And that alone was the basis of the clawback. So we may be moving to some sort of legal standard which is just automatically require that.
It's like an enforcement mechanism that may come about in a restatement case. That
Strict
all of a sudden,
liability was the term I was looking for.
then all the bonuses that are based on that have to come back.
Right.
And that's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people out there, I may be among them, I'm not quite sure, who would say, isn't that kind of the point of what we were trying to do with Sarbanes-Oxley, is to make people pay attention to this? Because if it goes wrong and you didn't know, that who cares? You know, you were the leader. Your name was on the certification. That's why we have sub-certifications. So we'll see.
So what particularly struck you, Jonathan, about, you've come, I think this is your third conference?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so what particularly struck you this year? New or different?
I'm almost the same as Mike. I think the challenge really is that, certainly in my session, in other sessions that I was at, you've got people at the very basic understanding and people with a very sophisticated understanding. You know, in my session, people who'd not heard of Privacy Shield, not heard of Safe Harbor, versus people who are full-time involved in compliance relating to big data, sweating huge pots of data. And I think that's a great opportunity for one group to learn from the other, and not just the obvious way. But it's also a conundrum. I agree with Mike. How do you get almost a twin stream conference going where people can understand it? But my overriding memory, I guess, is as per other years. It's a hugely vibrant conference, hugely vibrant environment. I'm personally heartened by the fact that it's clearly reaching out to people outside of the US and determined to improve compliance for good worldwide. And for all the minor quibbles along the way, we ought to say a big hurrah for that, I think. And from a purely personal point of view, I admired your very moving speech as well in getting your award. I think you said it absolutely right, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you said there about the need for evangelism.
And for all of Tom's fans, he's quite modest, but he received an award this year at the SCCE dinner, and apparently gave a great speech. I'm sorry I missed it, but
Matt was saving us from Donald Trump
I
last
was
night.
watching.
so-
I was watching Donald Trump, and I have to say,
Or
I'm
Mike,
sure.
rather.
Yeah, I'm sure that Tom's speech was a lot better. But I thought it was.
I had the temperament to be.
You have the best temperament that I've ever seen.
Is it too late for a new candidate?
But Tom, I mean, I would like to hear a little bit of the highlights of what you thought from the dinner and some of the other award winners. Obviously, you were in really esteemed company.
So I won kind of the individual award. The two that really struck me, I guess they all struck me. We had the Canadian Competition Committee, and it was classic Canadian. The chairman of the committee, or chairman of the competition council or bureau, received the award, and he was completely reticent. Completely understated, completely downplayed what they do, and they are about 5 paces past where the DOJ and SEC are.
In terms of acknowledging compliance programs,
Yes.
which is a big issue here.
They had already, before the DOJ thought of the Compliance Council, they had hired one. They have in-house expertise to evaluate. They do not simply enforce. They have made the decision that they need to be proactive because their mission is to get companies to do business in compliance, not enforce laws for companies who violate that. And it was very impressive. I mean, you never hear about that. The Sentencing Commission received a 25-year award because the U.S. Sentencing Commission guidelines went into effect in 1992, so we had a representative talk about that. I gave the award to Louis Sapperman from Dun & Bradstreet for that company's innovative use of social media in their compliance program. So I was particularly pleased that Louis and his team won the award. So it was a great group of recipients once again. So, and it's nice to win the Oscar. So,
and it does look like an Oscar.
It does. Matt, let me ask you, you've attended a lot of conferences over the years, of course, many on the Northeast FCPA corridor. What would you observe is the difference between sort of Compliance Week, ACI, those kinds of Boston, New York, Washington conferences, and SCCE?
The size, foremost. SCCE is certainly by far the biggest, most diverse collection of people I think that the industry has, which leads to, I really like the opportunity to meet so many other people from other parts of the world who are coming at these problems with very different perspectives, hear what's going on there. I do like the sort of very practical program-focused perspective. If you go to an ACI event, for example, you can wind up with a lot of outside counsel attending some of those, which is fine. Outside counsel is an important thing, and I have many friends who work at law firms, but their concerns and their thoughts and their practices are different than what an internal compliance executive would have. But really, more than anything else, it's just the sheer diversity of people, and it's a testament to SCCE that they've built this community up over 10 or 15 years since whenever it was that they started the corporate compliance conference itself. You really have to admire what Roy Snell and Adam Turtletop and the rest of the lieutenants have done.
Yeah. I was interviewed by SCCE before I received my award, and I was given this question, which really I thought was completely odd. And the question was, well, Tom, you and some of the older members of SCCE, and so immediately I was on my heels. He said, but the profession's aging. How are we going to bring new people in? And I thought, what are you talking about? But it got me to thinking about it, and what I realized is certainly everyone at this table, none of us started out in compliance, and we've evolved, or our careers have led us to this point, but we started off in a different profession with a different focus, or at least a different professional focus, and we are now to the point where some universities are beginning to have some sort of compliance, if not degree, a specialization. And as we move forward with that, perhaps we'll have less trial lawyers or less general counsels moving into CCO roles or compliance roles, and we'll have a pipeline of compliance professionals.
But I mean, when I look around, I just see these what I think are very young people.
So to me, it's a very young field.
I
I
think
see a
that's
lot
right.
of young people, but you raise, really big question to me, which is, when you go down to the exhibition area, there were now 3 or 4 law schools or schools, and before maybe there was 1, maybe 2, but now we see more law schools offering sort of compliance programs or compliance adjuncts to their normal program. But I also see it happening in MBA programs. Now we have more than just the one ethics class that you have to take, and they all, probably cheat on them to get through their MBA program. But nonetheless, but what I'm
Cynic.
Cynic, I know. But what I'm saying is, and then we have even graduate programs, for example, in healthcare,
Right.
Healthcare management, and public health schools, where now there's a compliance component to it. One of I think Rutgers now has, with their law school, has a focus just on healthcare compliance. And so who's going to be responsible for developing programs and developing this pipeline of people? Or is it going to be something that you have to go out and sort of pick and choose and find your way? And I think that ultimately gets back to a broader question, and I hate to ask an esoteric question at the end of the podcast, but where is compliance as a profession going? What are going to be our definitions, for ethical conduct? What are going to be our boundaries in terms of who is a compliance professional and who isn't? And then that gets to how do you educate people and bring them and hold them to certain standards. So those are. I don't feel. I know that law schools are getting into it, and it's great to have lawyers, but I also see downsides to lawyers because, as we always say, we're recovering. You say you're a recovering lawyer. I try to say I'm a problem solver as opposed to a lawyer. And there is something to that. Lawyers bring some skills, but we need other skill sets
Right.
when you come into this.
But I agree with you about the profession getting younger. I mean, I suppose one of my biggest exposures to compliance, I went in-house to a large US corporation for a time, and their absolute rule was all of the compliance team, it had to be their last job in the organization. Mm-hmm. You were not allowed to go into a compliance role unless it was your last job. And they said, firstly, to add experience, and secondly, so that you didn't have any favors that you had to pay back into your next role. And so obviously,
I would call that coach.
Yeah, and it was an odd environment, and particularly I'm a 25-year-old lawyer at the time, going in and working with this team. But I think here, against that perspective, there's lots of younger people. I volunteered for the mentoring scheme, and there were students still at university, and their professors had sent them along to the mentoring group here as a try before you buy, if you like, get a feel for the profession, use the mentoring scheme that existed here on Sunday, talk to people, see whether it's the career for you. And we need these people. The projection is that the GDPR, this new data protection regulation in Europe, alone requires 25,000 data protection officers if people are going to observe the regulation. Now, whether that figure's right or wrong, 25,000 is a lot of people to find versus, I don't know what the UK legal profession is, I guess about 80,000. So if you look at that as a percentage, even though it's Europe-wide, that 25,000 is a lot of people to find in a hurry, given that we've 18 months to find them.
So my concern isn't so much whether the profession is getting older or younger, although I do think it is getting younger, but it is getting, I would say, even more professionalized than it is. And if we keep on saying compliance officers are supposed to know the business, which we all do, that means at some point in your career you are not in compliance. You are doing something else, learning the business. And if you are getting churned out of a university with a compliance degree at age 22 and you're working compliance your whole life, you're not learning the business.
Well, one company that I know, they rotate people out. You go out into the business unit for a while, then you return to compliance.
Procter & Gamble does something like that.
It's traditionally the Japanese way as well, that you are rostered around teams and then you eventually come back into the compliance function.
And I think that's an interesting requirement because put you out there with those incentives, with those demands, and then come back and now what's your perspective as a compliance officer?
Let me change the focus a little bit, and we've got different professions here: journalists, legal profession. So let me pitch the question this way, Matt. From your perspective as a journalist and certainly a business journalist for many years, what has been your observation, or have you seen companies change in the mistakes they're making, or are they making the same mistakes over? And then let me ask the two lawyers, Mike, from the enforcement perspective, do you see that sort of similar enforcement of the same types of mistakes here in the U.S. from the Department of Justice? And then Jonathan, from the SFO's perspective, do you see them or the UK court system going after different types of crimes, or is it just changed from financial fraud to mortgage fraud to something else fraud? So
I think, are they making different mistakes? Well, having just seen a session an hour ago where 95% of all FCPA infractions involve third parties, it does kind of sound like they keep making the same mistakes. But I think that I would look more at what are they really grappling with these days is how to bring so much more technology into the programs that they run. I don't know that I would call them mistakes so much as there's a lot of trial and error going on these days and trying to figure out questions that have never actually been answered before. 8 or 9 years ago, we would have been at this conference and nobody would have talked about social media. Nobody would have talked about social engineering and phishing attacks as a threat for data privacy. That's all new stuff. And are we making the same mistakes? It's kind of unfair to say that they're the same mistakes when these mistakes are so new. So I think about things like that. The other thing that I do think of is there's still people who struggle with the leadership challenge. And that's really the senior executives, the CEO, and the board all talk a good game right up until you see these pervasive sort of problems, like either at Wells Fargo, which was a considerable, widespread problem at Wells Fargo, and nobody has bothered to take responsibility at the top for this, or you would see something like Mylan Labs, which was perfectly legal for them to raise their EpiPen prices to crushing extents, and nobody ever stopped to think, well, even though it's legal, isn't it kind of jerkish to do it?
Yeah.
And you run into those kind of problems, which that's where I think maybe we are still making the same mistakes that we did 10, 15 years ago.
One area that highlights for me that I still see and I think is not a problem that's getting any better is at the board level and at the senior executive level. Board members may be able now to say the right words, but to me, until the board knows how to conduct oversight and monitor a compliance program, they're usually ineffectual, in my view. Senior executives, there are certain CEOs that get it. I've been in companies where a CEO gets it, and it's an absolute breath of fresh air. And it's a great way to sort of, take the temperature of a company. The problem is in the follow-through. I think everybody knows, and everybody's been pushed and educated by the aggressive enforcement environment to say these things, put in place certain things, but nobody knows how to do it, how to implement it. The board doesn't know what it's doing. And so they need to be trained. Instead, they have lawyers, the old guard lawyers from, and I hate to use this, New York law firms sitting there. Don't do this. Let's protect ourselves from litigation. Don't do this. Put only this in the minutes. Don't do this. Don't consider this issue. And we have to change that dynamic in the boardroom. That's where, and it's very hard to get, even writing about it, I would say, and writing about this issue, and trying to get the board's attention is difficult in this. And I don't know if you find with your executive compensation type writing or your writing about it, Tom, that people are really receptive to say, you know what, let's start looking at the way the board's running this.
Here's the thing that struck me about Wells Fargo board. I looked at the board. There were 2 former cabinet secretaries, 2 3-star generals, a couple of other politicians, and my first thought was, what do they know about running a corporation?
Yep.
That's a great.
And do they have a staff that tells them? I mean, are they like a senator with an entire staff feeding everything up to them? And I wonder, are these boards even competent to do that?
But let me, and I'm sure in everyone's experience, have you ever gone and dealt with a company where there's a board member who was a former compliance officer.
Internal audit.
Or
close.
internal audit. Yeah, and to me, there's an absolute difference from that one person on the board because they raised the right issues, they asked the right questions, and the dynamic in the boardroom changes. So when you think about should a compliance officer be on the nominating committee or advising, playing a role at the nominations level, to me, there's a fundamental question that has to be asked. If compliance and ethics is going to be a priority, who's going to represent that on the board? Who's going to carry that message?
So here's a controversial question then for what we talked about executive compensation. Do we pay full-time executives too much and non-execs too little? Because if I'm only getting $20,000 a year
As a board member.
As a board member, as a non-executive board member, can I reasonably be expected to be the brakes on the bus?
Well, first off, most of these companies we're talking about, people are paid far more than
It's
that.
minimum 250,000.
Really?
Yeah,
So,
and
so
plus
that
stock
I think
or
would be
whatever
different from-
incentives. But
Yeah,
but
and
even assuming
Stock
that,
incentives to raise a price.
yeah, and so I do believe that in most cases you can say the reason this happened, where you can trail all the fault, and eventually you get to the board and the C-suite. Because they fail to oversee and monitor a program and ask the right questions, and they would have detected it. To me, it's going to be interesting to see what Yates leads to in Wells Fargo. Who knew what and what did they do? I'll bet you they're going to find evidence of what I would call benign, not benign neglect, but neglect, and not criminally culpable neglect, but evidence of that. But going to the question you asked me in terms of enforcement, I think we've seen a big change from the DOJ perspective. And this has really led to a great difference in the way that the law is enforced. I think there was a push, and as you mentioned, Jonathan, not to bring big cases, get huge fines, and that was your goal.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the end product, and impose maybe a monitor, but get them to comply. All these requirements, and think about it, outside counsel became the outside source for gathering the evidence, collecting the evidence, and bringing it to us. We sat there. I used to say I could have gotten a few convictions as a prosecutor if I was in the current DOJ, because I would sit there and people would bring me cases. And so my point with that is, once you change the bar to that, then what are we looking at? Let's look at OFAC violations, FCPA violations, which are handed to you on a silver platter, most of them. Okay? Not any of the really complex accounting fraud cases like we had with WorldCom, cases that are there, I'm sure they're there, but there's not the same emphasis in a long investigation. Antitrust has a constant mill of cases because of its leniency program. So they're fine. They get their cases that come in that way.
But that's the same pipeline now that the DOJ is trying to get with the pilot program.
And that's exactly what's happening. And what I'm saying is we're not getting into what are the more complex cases, which take more work, which take more effort, that can't just be assembled by an outside counsel investigation.
Right.
And where they don't have necessarily the tools that you may need to take that witness, put them in front of the grand jury, or threaten them, or whatever, to say, you're going to get charged, you better flip. They don't have that resource at that time. Now, maybe it gets handed over to DOJ, but they don't have the same familiarity and momentum on building a big case. So I think what's happening are these, and I call them relatively easier case of OFAC violations. 300,000 transactions that shouldn't have gone to the Sudanese banks. Boom, outside counsel tells them, here's the calculation, here's how much you owe. What about the complex fraud cases? Wells Fargo, to me, is going to take work. And what we saw when they failed to bring the financial crime cases of 2008 and 2009, they weren't willing to do the work. They lost the first case coming out of the box in the Eastern District of Brooklyn, and they should have won that case. They lost it against the two Bear Stearns executives, and they got chickened out at that point. They wouldn't do any more of those cases. And that's where we're going to see it. So Wells Fargo, to me, is a big test, as is Volkswagen.
So let me refocus your question a little bit, because you started off your remarks, Jonathan, talking about a case in England where the prosecution collapsed, and that was the Victor Dadala prosecution, collapsed in mid-trial. So how has the SFO really changed the calculus of the way people view it from that debacle to now to what I perceive very strong deferred prosecution agreements? They seem to be on a roll, and they seem to have really changed how people perceive them.
I think they have, and I think part of it is Dardal, I think in some respects was a watershed. I think DPAs have helped and will help. I think it has focused corporations' attention. Some people could say that the first one was a bit of a gift for them in some respects. It had all the hallmarks. If you're going to do a DPA, it's an incoming owner that can blame the outgoing people, and it's all tidy. In some respects, it's a great illustration of how compliance can save the day. As the case, even though the bribery occurred, it was ironically the AML program that picked up the bribery within the bank. So it's an unusual case from that point of view. But I do sense an uptick in activity and enforcement. And it's important to remember, of course, that the SFO is not the only game in town. We have some Scottish cases.
Is it the FCA?
The financial...
the bank?
FCA are involved in some interesting stuff. They've had a paper out recently on an enforcement activity on insurers supervising the work that's brought into them through third parties, etc., etc.
But Jonathan, one of the interesting things that when you were talking about the DPAs is I actually would like to see more of your model here in terms of the judges playing an active role. And I think that actually is a good model as a check on what's going on when the government comes in with a DPA.
Yeah, I do think that that's a welcome thing. The difficulty, I think, with the whole regime at the moment versus, let's say, the former regime is the perception is that self-reporting was rewarded in some respects, in much the same way as it's perceived as doing in the US. And it's sometimes hard to see the benefits of self-reporting, even with a DPA, because you've got the potential to do a deal with the prosecutor, but the judge doesn't approve it. So I think that's the downside of it. But I think from a public policy point of view, we had cases before DPAs came in when there was criticism that there was an unfair division of the spoils of war, if you like, between the US and the UK authorities. So I think in some respects it's more fitting to the UK system that we have judicial supervision.
But you have some big investigations going.
We do.
I mean, Rolls-Royce is going on, which I think is a big one. And I know you're in some other ones as well. So.
Yeah, there's 8, 10, 12, 15 that are public. That are public. Exactly, that's the case. And David Green's reminded us recently that he doesn't brag about cases for bragging's sake, and that he said that his list is mostly companies that have already made a public statement to the market, and he feels that he can share the details on that basis. Back to your original question though, Tom, one thing that we've not yet touched on, and let's touch on it very briefly, as a matter of personal regret, one of the real themes of this conference has regrettably been slavery. Yes. And I think to your point about are we seeing the same cases again, I think most of us thought that, certainly from a UK perspective, that we'd abolished slavery in the 1800s.
Right.
And it's shameful that we require new legislation in the UK to abolish it again. And I'm personally, this isn't a political point, I'm proud of the fact that the UK has decided to make a very public stand against slavery again. When you look at the figures, and for full disclosure, my firm's been very involved in helping some corporations cope with slavery. It is a multifaceted problem. In the UK, for example, I think the estimate is 80% of hand car washing operations are touching slavery in some way, whether that be Romanian gangmasters bringing the car washers over, whether they be money laundering operations, because obviously hand car washing is a cash business, etc., etc. But I think that's a theme that a number of the sessions touched on, and I'm just personally regretful that we're having to spend. It is right that we're spending so much time, but we're talking so much in this day and age about children and adults, male and female, being forced to, being transported halfway around the world to work in squalor for free. And, if there's one good thing this conference can do, it's to raise the awareness of slavery and get rid of this evil.
Certainly can't blame that on open borders. As we found out today, there's 500,000 in the United States. So, Well, gentlemen, this has been way too much fun. We have to figure out a way to do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been great. So I'd like to thank you all for letting me record this podcast, and look forward to visiting again. Maybe next year in Las Vegas.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. I have 2 calls to action for you. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you'd go to iTunes and rate us. It would definitely help us in our rankings. The second thing is I'm developing my next list of questions for my next mailbag episode. So if you have any questions you've been pondering or would like to put out there for consideration, please email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report.